Welcome to Exploring Santa Cruz, a bi-weekly program hosted by Jean Kratzer and Mathilde Rand. My name is Mathilde Rand, and I will be speaking with Frank Perry, curator of the Capitoal Historical Museum. We will be exploring the people that inhabited the area that is now called Soquel Capitola, aspects of the history of Capitola, and the role of the Capitoal Historical Museum. Welcome, Frank.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you start us off by giving us a brief history of your involvement with local history, and in particular becoming curator of the Capitoal Historical Museum?
I was born in Santa Cruz, and for some reason, I'll probably never know why, I have been interested in local history since I was a kid. I always thought the local history was more interesting than U.S. history or world history, mainly because I could see things locally right in my own backyard that I could relate to. So I started gathering information on local history when I was still in junior high and high school. In college, I took Sandy Leiden's wonderful class at Cabrillo College, and that was a big help to me in learning how to pursue history more seriously. Then I've been involved with the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, served on the publications committee there for many years. In 2013, I was appointed curator of the Capitoal Historical Museum, and I have had that job ever since.
Fantastic. And of course, you follow a great historian by the name of Carolyn Swift, and you probably know her real well.
Yes, I still email her with questions once in a while. She was the director of the museum for 20 years, so she has an awful lot of knowledge about Capitola history.
Why don't we start at the beginning and ask you to talk about the indigenous people that lived in this area of Soquel Capitola?
When I give talks on local history, I always like to start out by saying a little bit about the people who have lived in this area for many, many years, probably thousands of years, in fact. Many people don't realize it, but a number of years ago, there was an archaeological dig in the Scotts Valley area, and when they got way down to the bottom, they dated some of the materials that they found, and they went back between 12 and 13,000 years ago. So people have lived in the Santa Cruz, Watsonville, Capitola area for a long time. And when you think about it, the Soquel Valley must have just been a fabulous place for people to live in those days. It was protected and sunny most of the time. When you get up in the valley, there was the creek there that was full of fish in those days, and lots of plants and other animals for food. So it must have just really been wonderful.
And then, of course, we got the Ranchos, and in particular, Martina Castro, who was a Rancho grantee. Can you tell us a little bit about her? And because she set off, she was kind of at the beginning of a lot of things here in Capitola, Soquel.
Yes, a large part of Capitola was originally part of the Soquel Rancho. And this was land that was granted to Martina Castro in the 1830s. It was about 1,600 acres, and but that wasn't enough land for her. She raised cattle, so she asked for some more land and got an additional grant, and ultimately ended up having about over 30,000 acres, which went from the summit of the mountains all the way to Monterey Bay, and from Soquel Creek over to where about Cabrillo College is now.
Right. And what happened with the area after Martina had it?
Well, Martina had quite a few children, and some of the women married men who were unscrupulous, and so they succeeded in getting a lot of her land away from her. It was really a rather sad story. She didn't speak English, and she did not read or write, and so people took advantage of her after the Americans moved in. So the big ranchos, her rancho and other ranchos, were mostly broken up and subdivided. A lot of her land up in the mountains was full of redwoods, so that was logged by people like F.A. Heen, who I think you also wanted me to talk a little bit
Yeah.
about.
Yeah, because he bought the land, which is now Capitola Village, from the heirs of Martina, right? He didn't get it directly from Martina. Did he get it from the heirs?
Correct.
And so tell us about Frederick Heen. He was a native of Germany.
Yes, he was born in Germany, came to this country when she was only about 20, and settled in Santa Cruz in 1851, and was a genius when it came to business and amassed a great fortune rather quickly. He was involved with logging. He was involved in building the railroad between Santa Cruz and Watsonville. He was involved in agriculture. He also built the wharf in the what was then called the Soquel Wharf, but it's the wharf that is now the Capitola Wharf. And he leased the land in Capitola village area to the Hall family around 1870 or 1872. And they were farmers, but they realized that, hey, this is a great place for a resort. People would come there and want to pitch their tent and enjoy the beach. So they decided, with Heen's blessings, to capitalize on that. And in the early 1870s, established what they called Camp Capitola, which was a summertime resort. Originally, it was just tents. And then later on, various buildings were added, and a dance floor and stables for people to put their horses. Capitola got a big boost in the mid-1870s when the railroad went in. As I said, Heen was involved in getting that railroad built, and he made sure that that railroad went through as many of his properties as possible, including Capitola. Even in the 1870s, you could get on the railroad at Capitola. You could go through Watsonville to Pajaro. There you could get on the train with the Southern Pacific. You could go all the way to the East Coast if you wanted to. So Capitola was very well connected early on.
How was life in those camps? Was it harmonious? Was it joyful? Was it pleasant resort? How did people live?
Capitola was a wonderful place. You read the accounts of Capitola in the newspapers and you look at the brochures. There were a lot of different things that people could do. Not only, later years when it got developed a little bit more, people had their choice. They could stay in the big hotel, or they could rent a cabin, or they could pitch a tent. They had their choice depending on their budget. And there were hiking trails and fishing in the creek and fishing in the bay and hiking, horseback riding, swimming, beach combing. And there was also various concessions. Later on in the early 1900s, the movie theater was added. It was a place where families could really have a lot of fun.
So we just talked about all the wonderful things that people could do at Camp Capitola. When he died in 1913, his daughter inherited.
Yeah, can you imagine that? How'd you like to have a father who, when he died, wills you a town?
Yeah. But she didn't keep it for a long time, is it?
No, she only kept it for a few years.
Uh-huh.
In 1919, she decided to sell to a man named Henry Allen Rispin of San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
Rispin was, by accounts at the time, an oil millionaire. We don't really know if he was a millionaire or not, but he did have a lot of money. He'd been successful drilling for oil in Colorado and Wyoming. But he decided to get out of the oil business and focus more on real estate. So he bought Capitola as an investment. His idea was to make some improvements, sell lots for home sites, and then probably after a few years, move on to some other project. He did have a major influence on Capitola in the 1920s. Mm-hmm. He, of course, built his large home, which still stands, the Rispin Mansion on Wharf Road. But he also did a lot of other things. He rearranged buildings and fixed up the town. He paved the streets and improved the water system, put in the seawall, put the curve in the esplanade. He was responsible for a lot of changes. And there were other things that he was indirectly connected with in the 1920s. There was an airport that was put in the 1920s, and there was a fancy beach club that was built next to the wharf. And also the Venetian court was built in about 1924. So the 1920s was a very important decade for Capitola.
The Roaring Twenties, huh?
Yes, it was roaring in Capitola.
Didn't last too much for him. Did he go bankrupt?
You know, I've talked quite a bit with Carolyn Swift about this, and I think she summarized it best when she said he was just a lousy businessman. He really didn't know how to run a town. He should have stuck to oil. I think he realized this, and he made a lot of mistakes. A lot of the improvements that he made to Capitola were wonderful, but they weren't improvements that brought in extra money.
Mm-hmm.
And so he sunk a lot of money into Capitola, and eventually had to mortgage a lot of it. And ultimately, at the end of the decade, he lost it all.
And then I understand that around the same time, somebody proposed a joint Soquel Capitola municipality called Sotola, but it didn't pan out.
Well, that's a fun story. That also happened in the 1920s.
Uh-huh.
In the latter part of the 20s, the residents of Capitola weren't too happy with the way Rispin was running things, and they began to think, well, maybe we should become an official town, an incorporated city, and have a city council and planning department and so forth, like incorporated cities do, and a police department. And so they met with various people from Soquel and had a meeting at the church hall in Capitola to see about joining to form a city. And it was going to cover a fairly large area of the mid-county. But at the very first meeting, when they asked for a show of hands on how many people were in favor of this, a majority were not. So it pretty much died right then. But they came up with a great name. They combined Soquel and Capitola, and they were going to have this town called Sotola. And today there's a restaurant in Capitola Village called Sotola. They got the idea. They saw that name in Carolyn's book and adopted it. And I think it's a great name.
It is. What happened to Capitola then?
Well, I should continue saying what happened to Rispin.
Okay.
Rispin tried to go back into the oil business in the 1930s, but it was the Depression and it didn't work out. A Santa Cruz realtor ran into him at some point in the 30s or early 40s and said that he was penniless. He gave him $20 to buy food. And this was a man who traveled everywhere in a chauffeur-driven limousine and wore the finest, built a $250,000 house when most houses cost about $2,500. So he really went downhill. It was quite sad. He's buried in an unmarked grave up in Colma.
So let's talk a little bit about specific places, events, and activities. Let's start with the Venetian court. What can you tell us?
Venetian court is a widely recognized Capitola landmark. It's right there on the beach and lagoon and has all these multicolored units. So it attracts a lot of attention. It has appeared on postcards and calendars and so forth. It was built in 1924 by some developers from Santa Clara. Rispin sold the individual lots for the different units. And I think the units sold right away. So it was quite successful. and remains very popular to this day. Some of the units are owned by families that have had them for many, many years. And part of it is also a motel, so you can actually stay there if you want to.
I know. I walk by there and I really find it very homey and very pleasant. And I think it's a great asset for Capitola. Now, there were disasters. Can you tell us a little bit about the fires in 1930s?
Well, Capitola, it's a wonderful place, but it has had its share of disasters over the years. Especially in the early years, early 1900s, there were several bad fires. 1926, there was a fire that wiped out several buildings. The one that is most remembered by historians was the fire in 1929. There was a large hotel in Capitola called the Hotel Capitola, right where Esplanade Park is today. And in 1929, December, it caught fire and completely burned to the ground, 160 room hotel. So that was quite a spectacular blaze. Then in 1933, only a few years later, there was a fire wiped out the entire block surrounded by San Jose Avenue, the Esplanade, Stockton Avenue, and Capitola Avenue. And that was a really big disaster for Capitola. It was in February, but it didn't give them much time to rebuild before the summer season. That was a bad one. Then in 1957, a restaurant and nightclub called the Saba, which was where the hotel used to be, it caught fire and burned. One of the features there at the restaurant and nightclub, they were using the back part of it for a wax museum. So I
Oh,
always tell people, wax museums do not do well in fires. So that was sad. The guy who built it had several wax museums. He had one in Santa Cruz and one in Monterey. I guess wax museums were popular back then. But when you consider all the work that went into those, creating those figures, that was a real shame that that was all lost.
and then you had some storms and floods.
Capitola Village is right on Soquel Creek,
Mm.
and from time to time it has flooded. It was flooded in the 1955 flood. And then just a few years ago in 2011, a culvert broke under in Noble Gulch, and that caused about a foot of water to pour into Capitola Village. That was not good. There have been other kinds of storm damage. Capitola has been struck by large storm waves on a number of occasions through the years. The last time it was really bad was in 1983, but one of the most notable storm wave incidents occurred in 1913. And the waves that year were so big that they washed great big logs and seaweed and sand 2 blocks into Capitola, all the way to Capitola Avenue. And the waves wiped out the middle part of the Capitola Wharf. Now, that wouldn't have been so bad, except there was a person on the end of the wharf when the middle part washed
Oh
out.
my goodness.
He eventually got back safely, but that was pretty scary.
But then, of course, we have the creek hosting for many, many, many years the Begonia Festival. There is a plus side to having water nearby because it really drew a lot of people. And it's, I've been there several times. It was such an incredible event. So it's a unifying event. Tell us a little bit about the Begonia Festival.
In the middle 1900s and late 1900s, Capitola and the Mid-County area had quite a few flower growing businesses, including 3 companies that hybridized and grew begonias. There was the Antonelli brothers, the Brown Bulb Ranch, and Vetterli and Reinelt. And these were world famous begonia producers. The interesting thing about the begonias, they were growing them for the tubers. They sold tubers by mail order and so forth. So the flowers, while beautiful, were really a byproduct and would just go to waste. And so shortly after Capitola became an incorporated city, several people decided, we could have a festival and decorate floats with these flowers. They're free for the taking. The different companies said, sure, take all you want. So that's how the Begonia Festival started in the early 1950s with the decorated floats along the river. It was usually around Labor Day, and it had a lot of related events. Mostly people think of the nautical parade on the river and lagoon, but there was also the sand sculpture contest, which still exists, and a fishing derby. And in the earlier years, they had sailboat races and bicycle races and all kinds of different things.
A true festival. And you and the Capitoal Historical Museum have been involved with a highly successful Capitola Memories project. How did that come about?
Before I even got the job of curator, when the job was advertised, somebody commented online somewhere, well, if I was running the museum, I'd do more oral histories. And so that stuck in my mind, and I thought, well, that might be a good idea. Then we got some funding after I was there for about a year. And so I thought, some extra funding. So I thought, well, why don't we do oral histories, but do them on video so that you not only hear the person, but you see the person, which makes a big difference. You see their mannerisms and expressions. And so we started doing these video oral histories. We call it the Capitola Memories Project. We've done between 30 and 40 of them now, with people who either lived in Capitola for many years or grew up in Capitola or visited Capitola a lot. Mostly memories from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. But we've interviewed some really interesting people. I interviewed Steve Lawton, who in the 1970s lived in one of the Six Sisters right across from the beach. And he's a great storyteller. So that's a really fun interview. And I also interviewed a woman who, as a teenager, worked at the old Capitola Theater in the 1950s. Interviewed a fellow who, back in the 1930s, as a kid, used to fly model airplanes out at the Capitola Airport. A lot of great stories.
I went to the website, and I want to mention the website called City of Capitola, all one word, cityofcapitola.org/Capitola-museum. So one more time, cityofcapitola.org/Capitola-museum. And I listened to several of the stories and you interviewing them, and I was just enthralled with incredible stories. And so I highly recommend that our listeners go there. I think that we need to share with people where to find you, even though you're closed right now. But besides looking on the website, when it's open again, I highly recommend people go to 410 Capitola Avenue in Capitola. And in the meantime, if people have any questions based on this discussion or anything else, call you at 831-464-0322 or email you Capitola Museum, one word, capitolamuseum@gmail.com. And so I think what I need to ask you before we close here is there anything we missed? Because, you mentioned, just to start talking about the Capitola Theater, I have such fun memories of going to the movies there and now what they've done with it. But is there anything that you really think we missed and that we need to tell people right now?
I would like to add that all of those interviews, Capitola Memories interviews, are on YouTube, so people can watch them for free. And you can just go to YouTube and search for Capitola Historical Museum, and they'll start coming up. We also have a Facebook page, and we try to do at least one post each week with some historical photographs or other things of interest. And the museum, we are looking at getting the museum back open before too long. So check in with our Facebook page and our website if you want to see if it's open or not. Normally our hours are Thursday through Sunday from noon to 4 in the afternoons. We, of course, have been closed most of this year, but we do hope to get back open soon. We change exhibits every year, and this year's exhibit is called Capitola Then and Now, comparing old photographs with photographs of the same site taken today. So it's a fun exhibit. We were open for 1 week in March before we had to close down. But I think we'll probably keep that exhibit up on through most of next year as well, since not very many people have seen it yet.
And then, of course, if people can't come to the museum yet, they can go to your website and get the self-guided walking tour of Capitola. And there are some gems there. I actually, without having looked at this, rediscovered the hidden path along the bluffs, and it was just a delight to walk there. What a great surprise. And then when I looked at your website, I saw it on there. So this walking tour is on your website. I want to thank you, Frank, for a great conversation here, and we hope that we will have more, or maybe even in person see you at the Historical Museum.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me to be on your show.
Absolutely. This, of course, is Mathilde Rand for Exploring Santa Cruz, and we want to wish you a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.